On August 30th, 1835, Angelina Grimke sat down at her desk in her home in Philadelphia with a pen and paper. In the spirit of Jane Austen and Mary Wollstonecraft, Grimke, moved by recent social injustices, was attempting to voice her opinion while remaining sensitive to the times. Just a few days before, The Liberator, a progressive newspaper headed by fiery abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, had published an article announcing Garrison's single-minded commitment to end slavery forever. The daughters of a slave-owning family in South Carolina, Angelina and her sister, Sarah, were overwhelmed by Garrison's message. They personally understood the horrors of slavery and hated the cruel racist treatment of slaves. Angelina in particular became outraged with her family after witnessing the whipping and forced labor of a young slave at her home. She worked with her feminist sister Sarah to try to emancipate the household slaves on their plantation. Their father, a conservative and influential member in Southern politics, refused to listen to his daughters, so the sisters eventually left home for good in order to further their education and create a social impact in Philadelphia. Sarah and Angelina became increasingly involved in the rapidly growing abolitionist movement during the 1830s. Over the years, Angelina's interest and passion for the movement grew until she decided she could no longer remain silent. In a personal letter to William Lloyd Garrison, she applauded his progressive stance and proclaimed her admiration for his paper, ideas, and writing. Miles away in Boston, Garrison read the rare letter, intrigued at finding a Southern slave-owning woman who supported emancipation. Without her knowledge or permission, Garrison published Angelina's letter in the next edition of The Liberator. Neither of the Grimke sisters could have imagined the intense reactions. Suddenly, Sarah and Angelina were pushed into the public eye, confronted with both scorn and praise. Both sisters took advantage of their sudden fame to write influential essays pushing their message. The abolitionist community loved the Grimkes' bright, passionate voices. However, their family in the South was horrified. Their essays were burned throughout South Carolina, and they were threatened with arrest if they ever tried to return home. Though saddened, Angelina and Sarah Grimke were not alarmed. They had found their calling, fighting the heinous institution of slavery to ultimately impact the world. In 1837, encouraged by Garrison, the girls embarked on a speaking tour to educate women about the realities of slavery and to garner support. The Grimkes built a name for themselves and began to draw larger and increasingly diversified crowds. Garrison and the Grimkes were thrilled with the turnout and the success of their speeches. However, diverse crowds meant men were coming to listen to women speak. Suddenly, the Grimke sisters were no longer perceived as sweet young girls innocently aiding the movement, and scandals spread throughout the East Coast. Groups of both men and women began to criticize and abuse the sisters, branding them as unsavory and promiscuous. In May of 1838, Angelina Grimke was invited to speak at Philadelphia Hall for one of Garrison's Anti-Slavery Society conventions. Outside of the building, an angry mob began to riot, throwing rocks and screaming outside of the doors. Angelina held her audience for almost an hour, shouting back at the mob from her place on the stage and imploring her audience to recognize the importance of their current position.
When the women of these states send up to Congress such a petition, our legislators will arise as did those of England, and say, when all the maids and matrons of the land are knocking at our doors, we must legislate. Let the zeal and love, the faith and works of our English sisters quicken ours, that while the slaves continue to suffer, and when they shout deliverance, we may feel the satisfaction of having done what we could.
After her speech, Angelina was ushered away only to watch the mob set fire to the building where a woman dared to speak. She would never again return to the podium. Having spent their lives fighting for the rights of minorities, Angelina and Sarah found irony in the public humiliation and threats they faced for being a minority. In 1837, Sarah Grimke took up her pen, drawing together the causes of the abolitionists and feminists. In her pamphlet entitled Equality of the Sexes, Sarah became the first to compare the two movements by stating,
I believe it will be found that men, in the exercise of their usurped dominion over women, have almost invariably done one of two things. They have either made slaves of the creatures whom God designed to be their companions and their coadjutors in every moral and intellectual improvement, or they have dressed them like dolls and used them as toys to amuse their hours of recreation. We are much in the situation of the slave. Man has asserted and assumed authority over us.
The connection between the male-dominated movement for emancipation and the feminist movement was powerful and inspiring. After centuries of silence, educated women found that they had political opinions to voice. With their speeches and writings, the Grimke sisters broke through the mystical glass ceiling, allowing for more women to become involved in the movement. In 1840, 15 women were invited by William Lloyd Garrison to join the American delegation at the World's Anti-Slavery Convention in London. Together, they sailed 3,500 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, only to be met with shock and dismay from the male delegates. Many were appalled. Several notable Englishmen proclaimed that they would not attend the convention unless the women were removed. In the published transcript of the debate, the men claimed that female speakers were unnatural and contrary to British honor. Retorts that Queen Victoria was a woman fell on deaf ears. After about an hour and a half, a vote was called, and a huge majority decided that the women would be allowed to stay in the building with the condition that they remain behind a curtain in the back of the room. The progress of the Grimke sisters in the public sphere had not yet reached the political world. The dismay of the progressive female activists can only be imagined. However, two of the dismissed women, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, could be heard whispering behind the curtain, and later observers saw them walking down the streets of London arm in arm. These two women were plotting the retaliation and laying the tracks for the world's first major women's rights convention. As women began to come out from behind the curtain of the abolitionist movement, they started to fight for their own emancipation. After their shunning at the World Anti-Slavery Convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott began to shift their goals, making their aims far more personal: women's rights. Together, Stanton and Mott, incensed by their treatment from male contemporaries, organized a landmark event in the history of the women's rights movement: the Seneca Falls Convention. Held in 1848, the convention gathered together 300 like-minded advocates for women's rights. These were the most progressive-minded women of the time. Stanton was one of the most radical members of the convention, and was the main author of the famous Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, a document which outlined the goals of the movement. Stanton's wording was highly similar to that of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, and was meant to be a parody and to further prove the legitimacy of the claims. However, Stanton and Mott didn't see eye to eye on all of their goals. Stanton added this controversial line to the Declaration:
It is the duty of the women in this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise.
Both Stanton's husband and Lucretia Mott felt that this idea was far too radical. Mott was more conservative in her approach to women's rights, taking small steps in order to more effectively reach a longer-term goal. Stanton, however, felt that women were duty-bound to strive for every right that they deserved. In the aftermath of Seneca Falls, the public was highly critical of the women and their goals, feeling that they were out of line. Stanton took the criticism in stride, and in 1851 began her famed partnership with Susan B. Anthony. Raised as a Quaker, Susan B. Anthony had early on become heavily involved with the Daughters of Temperance organization. By the time she partnered up with Stanton, she was a widely known member of the abolitionist community. Anthony and Stanton made a perfect team because they shared many common goals, and they each had what the other lacked. Anthony managed business affairs and did most of the organizing, while Stanton was the intellectual brainchild and did the majority of the writing. However, not everything went smoothly during the fight for women's rights. In the antebellum years preceding the Civil War, the majority of American women stopped focusing on the women's rights movement. While Stanton and Anthony wished to keep the momentum of the feminist movement alive, the others refused to think of themselves during a national crisis. They dove into the abolitionist and war movements, assuming that after the war, they would be rewarded for their patriotism and granted the rights that they deserved. As the suffrage movement faltered, other women activists tried to make a difference where they could. Rights for the freed slaves, education, and temperance were hugely important issues around the Civil War era that could be remedied by women through acceptable means. The extremely influential novelist Harriet Beecher Stowe penned her famous novel Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. Stowe, who was called the little lady who started this great war by Abraham Lincoln in 1861, created highly sympathetic black characters who struggle with slavery and its consequences. Like Austen before her, Harriet Beecher Stowe used characters and plots to mend social ideas, and Uncle Tom's Cabin was the most popular book outside of the Bible for many years. The number of women receiving higher education was also increasing around the Civil War era. Oberlin College, which opened in 1833, was the first college in the United States to admit women and blacks. Mary Lyon, who was a pioneer in public education for people of all backgrounds, opened Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in Amherst, Massachusetts, 4 years later. Soon, many other all-women schools were opened as the answer to the male-exclusive Ivy Leagues, including Wellesley, Vassar, Smith, Bryn Mawr, Radcliffe, and Barnard. Many of the female leaders of the next generation would graduate from these schools. Lucy Stone was one of these women. She graduated from Oberlin College in 1847 after a hard-fought career breaking barriers at the mixed-gendered school. Stone desperately wanted to get involved in politics and public speaking, both classes that were offered at Oberlin, but were not open to women. She fought against the status quo of the university to allow a friend to debate her publicly on campus, where students and faculty praised her for her speaking abilities. She decided to take up a career in public speaking and activism, and eventually made a name for herself in the feminist movement. Part of her rights included her choice to keep her own name, leading to the popular trend of Lucy Stoners who refused to adopt their husband's surname. Her family continued to fight for equal rights as well. Stone's sister-in-law, Elizabeth Blackwell, became the first female to become a doctor, and her family started a weekly newspaper on women's rights entitled The Women's Journal. Though her contributions to the suffrage movement were substantial, Lucy Stone also took on causes for working-class women, such as temperance or the movement to limit alcohol consumption and abuse. Stopping the buying and selling of alcohol had huge implications in the lives of average women, because often men drank excessively and became angry and violent while intoxicated. Alcoholism and domestic violence were shown to affect women and family relations, and increased protection for women slowly became available as time went on. In 1861, the Civil War began, bringing about major social changes, such as one of the more radical, the 15th Amendment, which prohibited suffrage discrimination based on race, but not gender. Through the work of Stanton and Anthony in the post-war years, the women's suffrage movement began to reemerge, putting out a women's newspaper, The Revolution, and in 1869, jointly organizing the National Women's Suffrage Association. In 1866, women's and blacks' rights activists joined together to form the American Equal Rights Association, or AERA. However, in 1869, the tensions and opposing goals of the two groups became too much to bear. Ultimately, it was the issue over African American men and their relation to the women's rights movement that caused a major ideological split in the feminist movement. Stanton and the NWSA were angered by their exclusion from the 15th Amendment and publicly opposed it during the ratification process. The organization was viewed by contemporaries as far more radical, with the sole priority of securing suffrage for women. On the other hand, the AWSA, led by Lucy Stone and her husband, Henry Blackwell, supported the 15th Amendment. They were afraid that if women's suffrage was pushed too hard, that the 15th Amendment would not pass, and therefore the rights of twice as many would be lost. In 1890, Susan B. Anthony supported the unification of the two groups with the single united goal of gaining women's suffrage at the federal level. They formed NAWSA, or the National American Women's Suffrage Association. This involved a heavy amount of compromise from both sides, agreeing to focus on the single issue of the vote. This was difficult for Stanton, who was convinced that the best and only solution was the complete emancipation of women. However, their deaths at the dawn of the 20th century meant Stanton, Anthony, and Stone never saw the realization of all their hard work. With the accumulative effect of the betrayal of the 15th Amendment, the focus on unrelated activist movements, and the death of the pioneering suffragette figureheads, the movement continued to lose momentum at the dawn of the 20th century. On the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, however, the new generation of suffragettes set out in the streets of Washington to make a statement. Thousands of women from all over the globe congregated in order to march in honor of the enfranchisement and occupational achievements of women. Valiantly led by the white-clad Inez Milholland, the women set forth to march in a spirit of protest against the present political organization of society from which women are excluded, as the official event program informed curious onlookers. However, not everyone watching the parade was pleased with the political statement made by these bold women. As dramatized by this clip from the movie Iron-Jawed Angels, crowds of men began to jeer and constrict the marchers, often severely injuring them despite the presence of police. The agitated men, and even police officers, spit derogatory remarks, often shouting that the women should have stayed at home where they belonged. An influential woman at the time, Helen Keller, was present at the march and was quite shaken by the presence and action of the hateful crowd.
2 ambulances came and went constantly for 6 hours, always impeded and at times actually opposed, so that doctor and driver literally had to fight their way to give succor to the injured.
Such was the atmosphere that these brave, determined women were forced to endure. In their attempt to exercise their constitutional right to peaceful protest, it was recorded that more than 100 marchers were taken to a nearby emergency hospital. And by the afternoon, the then Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, sent a cavalry troop to control the reckless and hateful crowd. While the parade was a media success in and of itself, it also marked the transition into a more radical discussion over women's rights and roles due to the earth-shattering outbreak of World War I. While the men prepared for war, women were left to fill the vacancies throughout the industrial and professional workforce. At the time, society and the government promoted women's participation in the workplace due to the need for workers to manufacture ammunitions and other war supplies. The Washington Standards often posted such encouraging slogans as, "You should aid nation in the war," and "Everyone has to be a helper." It was said to be a woman's patriotic duty to fill the shoes left behind by her husband as he trekked across the earth to fight for his country. This attitude leads to increasing visibility of women in public places outside of her traditional domestic sphere. Women made gains in occupations traditionally associated with their gender, such as nursing, secretarial professions, and teachers. However, women also made gains in other more traditionally masculine occupations. As one newspaper, the Seattle Union Record, observed in 1918, there has been a sudden influx of women into such unusual occupations. However, women did not achieve total liberation during the war. One of the most popular jobs for a young girl was as a Red Cross volunteer nurse. The government, while encouraging women to do necessary work in factories, was also placing women back within the borders of domesticity. Women were still trapped in the sphere of the home. Ultimately, the joy of the armistice was accompanied by public amnesty towards working women. As the veterans returned from serving their country overseas, the government forced women to relinquish their newly gained occupational positions to the men, often forcing women back into the restricting sphere of domesticity. Many women, particularly young women, were not content to sit at home once they had tasted freedom. During these post-war years, many women began to push the societal boundaries, challenging traditional ideas of femininity by bobbing their hair and shortening the hems of their skirts. The bold acts by these so-called new women were some of the first steps towards an important goal in this struggle for female emancipation: suffrage. The NASWA, the brainchild of Elizabeth Cady Stanton several decades earlier, was on the decline, challenged by a newer and much more radical group, the National Women's Party. NASWA was no longer on the cutting edge of the feminist movement. Its members were aging and caught up in bureaucracy. The inflexibility of this group enraged the young Alice Paul, who was willing to do whatever it took in order to earn suffrage. She was impatient with the democratic processes, proclaiming,
"We women of America tell you that America is not a democracy. 20 million women are denied the right to vote."
Disillusioned with the organization, Alice Paul rescinded her membership and started her own grassroots activist group, the National Women's Party, or the NWP. Paul, along with her close friend, Lucy Burns, organized marches, protests, and petitions, including the controversial and dangerous Wilson Inauguration March on Washington. These suffragettes were willing to go the distance. Alice Paul was arrested several times and, while in prison, stated,
"Food simply isn't important to me."
Going on hunger strike, Paul and the other radical suffragettes would do anything to make a statement and earn publicity for the issues at hand. Alice Paul was violently force-fed on command from the wardens, who were determined to keep her just barely alive and prevent her from dying a martyr's death. She reported these incidents to her fellow prisoners, and word got out. Eventually, the hard work of multiple generations of women, spanning from antebellum America to the dawn of the 20th century. The day for emancipation had come. June 4th, 1919. Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and the rest of the NWP gather around their headquarters, eagerly awaiting any news from the Capitol. When word finally arrives, a chaotic celebration ensues, for Congress has passed the 19th Amendment of the Constitution. Women in the United States have finally won the right to vote. Of the 300 attendees of the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, only Charlotte Woodward was still alive in 1920 to witness the fulfillment of the Declaration of Sentiments which she had helped to outline decades before.
Gonna take a sentimental journey, gonna set my heart at ease, gonna make a sentimental journey to renew old memories. Got my back